So where I left off at the end of that last video is he was discharged from Northampton, and a lot of it had to do with his discerning process for allowing people to become communicant members of the church. He was requiring them to give an account of salvation or an account of the gospel. They didn't have to give necessarily their specific account for their own conversion, but they had to be able to demonstrate that they understood the gospel and that they understood that they were individually converted in order to become communicant members. And this ended up being a sticking point because his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, was one of the main proponents of the halfway covenant, in which you didn't have to have a communicant member for your children to be baptized into the church and to become those who got to participate and be a part of the church life. Well, all that said, Edwards ends up defending himself with a publication that he calls A Humble Inquiry. There is a council that is put together that is involved with his exit process, in which the local ministerial group made the decision about whether he would get to permit to continue to be the pastor at Northampton or not. He ended up not being able to be a part because the ministerial association voted for him to be dismissed. And he then took a period of discernment, close to a year, where he was still living in Northampton. He was still involved in the community. He was still preaching for either churches, because at this time there are multiple churches in Northampton. But in 1751, he moves his family to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and he becomes a missionary to the Indians. If you notice, this is after 1747, when David Brainerd has passed away, and so there is some possibility that this was a big part of what inspired him to live a quiet life in the frontier of Massachusetts at Stockbridge, bringing the gospel to the natives. This is a time in his life where he is prolific in publication. This is when he published Origin of he publishes his work on original sin. He publishes his work on freedom of the will. He is working on his two dissertations. The first dissertation, the end on which God created the world, and the second dissertation on true virtue. Both of those were published posthumously after he passed away in 1758. He leaves the missions on the frontier of Massachusetts to become the new president at the College of New Jersey. And so on February 16th, 1758, he is officially taking the oath to be the president of the College of New Jersey. It's his son-in-law, who was the second president of College of New Jersey, whom he succeeded. And his son-in-law, Aaron Burr Sr., who was married to his daughter, Esther Edwards Burr, passes away. And he passes away because of a fever that he has taken. In fact, the smallpox is spreading during this time in Princeton. And because of the spread of smallpox, and because of the fact that Edwards is a ministerial leader and somewhat of an innovator, he encourages Esther and her two children, Sally and Aaron Burr Jr., along with himself, decide to take a smallpox inoculation. And unfortunately, in the process of recovering from the smallpox inoculation, he receives a second fever, and he has smallpox appear much more aggressively than the first appearance of it that he had, and he ended up getting smallpox in his mouth and his throat closes, and he ends up starving to death after 2 weeks of having his throat basically shut off. And so his career as a minister and as a missionary and as the president of Princeton ends abruptly in the early spring of 1758. So he had actually only been in office as president for just over a month at this time. Edwards' works are prodigious. He has a corpus of 73 volumes of material. He has years and years of sermons that we have the manuscripts of and we have access to. He has series of miscellaneous notebooks of theological reflection that he kept, and we have 4 volumes of those that we can refer to in studying his thought. He had many publications. Some of the most significant are Religious Affections. He has another one that's called A Humble Attempt, which is a work in which he is encouraging people to enter into a concert of prayer in order to stimulate a second influx of revival. This is a work that was written in the mid to late 1740s. And then the second part of it is a depiction of his eschatology, which is a post-millennial eschatology. He also published these major works of philosophy on original sin, on freedom of the will. He also has some earlier philosophical works on being, on Adam, on the mind, that were published very early. They weren't published, but they are notebooks from early in his studies when he's a Yale student. And immediately following his time at Yale when he's in Manhattan as a Presbyterian church minister. He had a large family, and as somebody who had a large family, he ended up having a large legacy. We've already talked a little bit about Aaron Burr Sr. being the president of the College of New Jersey. He also has a grandson, Timothy Dwight, who becomes the president of Yale University and is greatly responsible for the Second Great Awakening. He and his successors of his modern New England divinity movement becomes the theology of New England for up until the Civil War, and it's the most widely inculcated and spread theological movement. It's the first theological movement that's native to the Americas, colonial America, and it ends up becoming overruled by the Princetonians later. But it was the most influential theological movement. It was mostly championed immediately by his followers Samuel Hopkins and Joseph Bellamy, but then Timothy Dwight and one of his main theologians at Yale, Nathaniel Taylor, was another proponent of it, along with another of his scions, Sereno Dwight, who also was one of the major publishers of Jonathan Edwards' works. He also was a major proponent of the New England divinity. Mostly this is Calvinistic doctrine. This is a understanding of freedom of the will. It's the glory of God in all things. It's an account of his providentialism. These are the main ideas behind the New England theology. This ends this lecture.